terribly wrong. Your father refused the evacuation order, the officer said. The storm is making landfall in 6 hours, and he's still inside the lighthouse. Elena gripped the kitchen counter, her knuckles turning white. Her father, Thomas, had kept that lighthouse burning every single night for 41 years. Through hurricanes, through his own wife's funeral, through Elena's entire childhood spent wondering why a tower full of glass and machinery always seemed to matter more to him than she did. Why won't he leave? Elena asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer wouldn't make sense to her, the same way it never had. He says the light cannot go dark, the officer said. He says he made a promise. He won't tell us to who. Elena hung up the phone and immediately began packing a bag, driving through the night toward the coast, toward a man she hadn't spoken to in almost 2 years, toward an answer she had spent her entire life wanting and never quite receiving. By the time she reached the harbor, the storm had already begun tearing at the edges of the sky. And what she would learn about her father before that night ended would finally explain 41 years of a devotion she had always mistaken for something else entirely. Welcome to Digital Story Corner. Sit back, relax, and let's begin. Thomas Whitfield became the keeper of Marrow Point Lighthouse at the age of 24, taking over the position from a retiring keeper who had held it for nearly 3 decades before him. The lighthouse sat on a narrow, wind-battered spit of rock off the northern coast, accessible only by boat, its beams sweeping across nearly 11 miles of frequently treacherous water that had claimed dozens of vessels across the decades before automated systems became common elsewhere along the coastline. Elena grew up on that same spit of rock for the first 12 years of her life, in the small keeper's cottage attached to the lighthouse itself, before her mother finally insisted the family relocate to the mainland so Elena could attend a proper school without the difficulty of the daily ferry crossing. Thomas stayed behind, commuting back and forth to see them on his days off, though those days off grew increasingly rare as automated lighthouses became standard practice and funding for keeper positions like his dwindled year after year. Elena remembered a childhood defined by her father's absence during exactly the moments that mattered most. He missed her 8th birthday because of an unexpected storm system that required him to stay through the night monitoring the light manually. He missed her middle school graduation because the automated backup generator had failed that same week and he refused to leave the light unattended while repairs were underway. Most painfully, he missed her wedding entirely, staying behind during what should have been a calm, ordinary weekend, citing only a vague, unexplained feeling that he needed to be at the lighthouse that particular night. By the time Elena reached her 30s, married with 2 children of her own, her relationship with her father had worn down to strained holiday visits and a distance neither of them seemed to know how to close. She had spent years quietly resenting a piece of machinery she genuinely believed her father loved more than his own family, unable to understand why any job, however important, could justify an entire lifetime of absence. 2 years ago, that resentment finally boiled over during an argument neither of them fully recovered from. The Coast Guard had announced plans to fully automate Marrow Point Lighthouse, a modernization effort that would finally allow Thomas to retire after 4 decades of service. Elena, desperate for her father to finally choose their family over that isolated tower, urged him enthusiastically to accept the automation and move to the mainland permanently. Thomas refused, adamantly and almost desperately, insisting he needed to remain the human keeper of that light for reasons he refused to fully explain, triggering an argument that ended with Elena leaving in tears and not speaking to her father again for nearly 2 years. Now, standing at the harbor with a storm bearing down on the coastline, Elena boarded one of the last Coast Guard vessels willing to attempt the crossing, desperate to reach her father before the weather made rescue completely impossible. The crossing was violent and terrifying, waves crashing over the bow of the small vessel, visibility reduced to almost nothing in the driving rain. When they finally reached the base of Marrow Point Lighthouse, Elena scrambled up the rocky embankment alongside 2 Coast Guard officers, fighting against wind that nearly knocked her off her feet entirely. She found her father inside the lighthouse's small control room, drenched and exhausted, manually adjusting equipment that had partially failed during the storm's first assault, refusing every attempt by the officers to convince him to evacuate immediately by helicopter while conditions still barely allowed it. "Dad, please," Elena begged, grabbing his arm. "It's just a light. Please, come with us." Thomas turned to look at his daughter, something breaking open behind his exhausted eyes. "It was never just a light," he said quietly. "Sit down. I need to finally tell you why." With the storm howling outside and time running dangerously short, Thomas finally told Elena a story he had carried, silently, for nearly 50 years. When Thomas was 12 years old, his own father had been a fisherman working these exact waters, relying on Marrow Point's beam to guide his small boat safely home through dangerous nighttime crossings. One particular night, during a sudden violent storm remarkably similar to the one now battering the coastline, the lighthouse keeper on duty at the time, exhausted and frightened by the severity of the weather, made the fateful decision to abandon his post and evacuate to safety, allowing the light to go completely dark for nearly 4 critical hours. Thomas's father, unable to locate the coastline in the sudden absence of any guiding light, steered his small fishing boat directly into the treacherous rocks surrounding Marrow Point, and was lost at sea that same night, his body never recovered. Thomas, only 12 years old at the time, spent the rest of his childhood in a fatherless household, watching his mother work herself to exhaustion trying to keep their family afloat, blaming, quietly and completely, a stranger's decision to abandon a post during a single terrifying night. Thomas told Elena that he made a private, unshakable vow that very same year, standing at his father's empty memorial service, that if he ever had the chance, he would become the keeper of that exact light himself, and he would never, under any circumstances, allow it to go dark while lives depended on its guidance, regardless of the personal cost required to keep that promise. Every missed birthday, every missed graduation, even Elena's own wedding, had been Thomas honoring a promise made to his own father's memory as a grieving 12-year-old boy, a promise he had never once explained to his family because he didn't believe the weight of that old grief was something he had any right to burden them with. Elena sat frozen, finally understanding an entire lifetime of what she had always mistaken for simple neglect. Her father hadn't been choosing a lighthouse over his family. He had been quietly keeping a promise to a father he lost before he was even old enough to fully grieve him properly, terrified that if he ever once let that light go dark, some other family somewhere might lose exactly what he had lost as a boy. The storm outside intensified further, and the Coast Guard officers insisted there was no more time to spare, informing Thomas that the automated backup system had finally come back fully online, meaning his physical presence was no longer strictly necessary for the light to continue functioning safely through the remainder of the night. Thomas, seeing the system's status confirmed with his own eyes for the first time, finally allowed himself to be convinced to evacuate alongside his daughter. As the helicopter lifted away from Marrow Point that night, Elena watched her father staring back at the lighthouse beam, still sweeping steadily through the storm, tears mixing freely with the rain still clinging to his face. In the weeks following that storm, Elena and Thomas rebuilt the relationship 2 years of silence and an entire lifetime of misunderstanding had nearly destroyed completely. Thomas officially retired from active keeper duty once the automation was fully implemented, but he continued visiting Marrow Point regularly as a volunteer historical caretaker, finally allowing himself, for the first time in decades, to also simply be present for his own family without the weight of that old, silent vow constantly pulling him away. Elena began bringing her own children out to Marrow Point most summers now, watching her father teach his grandchildren the exact same lighthouse mechanics his predecessor had once taught him, this time freely sharing the full story behind why that light had always mattered so completely to their family. What Elena finally understood, after an entire lifetime of quiet resentment, was that some of the deepest devotion in the world doesn't always look the way we expect love to look. Sometimes it looks like absence, chosen painfully and silently for reasons buried decades deep, waiting patiently for a storm dangerous enough to finally force the truth into the open. If this story moved you, subscribe to Digital Story Corner and hit the bell. A brand new story drops every single day.